Tuesday, January the 26th, and welcome back to GoodFellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast examining social, economic, political, and geopolitical concerns in this time of pandemic. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm a research fellow here at the Hoover Institution, as well as the Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Fellow in Journalism. I'll be your moderator today. Now, if this is your first time watching GoodFellows, what you're about to see is a conversation in which three Hoover Institution senior fellows, or GoodFellows as we jokingly refer to them, offer their unique insights into what may lie ahead in these uncertain times. Let's meet the GoodFellows, beginning with John Cochrane. John's an economist, and he is the Hoover Institution's Rosemary and Jack Anderson Senior Fellow. Hello, John.
Hi, everybody.
Second GoodFellow joining us from his wilderness outpost is Niall Ferguson. Niall's a renowned historian and author, and he is the Hoover Institution's Milbank Family Senior Fellow. Hello, Niall.
Good to be back, Bill. Looking forward to this very much.
And our third GoodFellow, last but certainly not least, is Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. He is the Hoover Institution's Fuad Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow, and he is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Battlegrounds, A Fight to Defend the Free World. Hello, H.R.
Hey, Bill. Great to be with everybody.
So, gentlemen, we're doing things a little different today. We have a guest joining us today. We want to talk about COVID, and we thought, with no offense to you three learned gentlemen who are all PhDs, we thought we would bring an MD into the conversation to talk about the pandemic, what we know about lockdowns, vaccine distributions, and the most sensible strategy moving forward with this and other future strains coming our way. So joining us today is Dr. J. Bhattacharya. Dr. Bhattacharya, or Dr. J as he's known to his friends, is a professor of medicine at Stanford University, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economics Research, and a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research and Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute. Dr. J, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
Let's get one thing out of the way, especially since we have a renowned Philadelphia native, H.R. McMaster, on the show. When we say Dr. J is joining us, his eyes lit up because why? He thought basketball, dunking. How many lame Julius Erving jokes do you have to put up with on?
Are you kidding me? You would rather have him on the show than me. I completely understand.
Hey, and the Sixers look pretty good this season. I'm telling you. I mean, Philadelphia sports is making a comeback with the Sixers and Flyers in this season. So
okay. Ferguson and Cochrane are smiling, thinking, for God's sakes, when will you get serious? So let's get serious now. The news out of Sacramento yesterday, Dr. Bhattacharya, California is now adopting an age-based system to vaccinate its residents, shift away from the state's initial strategy of weighing job-based risk. If the current pace of local COVID-19 vaccinations continues, it'll likely take until about June to inoculate all of California's 65 and older residents. Who knows what happens to those who don't fall in that age group? There has been just consistently bad news coming out of California when it comes to vaccinations. Throughout January, California has lagged behind every major state in the nation in percentage of available shots administered. It's lagged behind the national average. At one point in January, California surpassed Alabama as a state in the nation with the lowest percentage of shots administered. By definition, that makes California the worst state in the nation at this game. So question for you, Dr. J, since all five of us work at a very imaginative university in a very intelligent state that at all times thinks that it is imaginative and futuristic, how did California get this wrong?
Well, I think just from the very beginning, the strategy was wrong. I think so I've been looking at projection models of what the right strategy to use is. There's one theory that says we should vaccinate people who spread the disease, are more likely to spread the disease. Another theory says we should vaccinate people who are at high risk of mortality from getting the disease. I fall very strongly in the camp of let's vaccinate people who are at high risk of mortality. The trying to guess who's going to spread the disease doesn't make a ton of sense. And in fact, Florida has followed this strategy. We know from lots and lots of data that people who are older are at the highest risk. Every 8 years or so of age doubles your COVID mortality risk if you should get infected. So I think just from the beginning, not prioritizing older people was an enormous mistake. And I think we sort of started to have seen this play out in California in very strange ways. There's also a lot of bureaucratic snafus that have happened in California that have in lots of other places, but in spades in California. Even the rollout to healthcare workers was much slower than in many other states. It's been I think a disaster all the way across in California for vaccine distribution.
Okay,
Can I push you on that? Because I've heard a lot of the opposite view, and so one of the opposite views. Alex Tabarrok's been very good on this. That strategy assumes it's just going to go, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. A lot of the point of the vaccine is to stop the spread of the disease. You're fighting exponential growth. And so the total number of people who die is much lower if you can stop the exponential growth of the disease, as opposed to just give up and try to protect people. In addition, there's two technologies for protecting people. One is give them the vaccine, and the other is don't put them in contact with the virus. So old folks are particularly able to stay home, maybe vaccinate their caregivers to make sure the caregivers don't give it to them. And that also does nothing for the economy, which is tanking. Vaccinating is a license to go out and work. People who are to take the worst example, take somebody who's has dementia sitting in a nursing home doing nothing. They're not going to spread it to anyone else, and we could stop them from getting it by other means. Why don't we use this is the central conceptual question. Are we to use this vaccine to stop the exponential growth of a disease, get R under 1, or are we to use the vaccine to protect people who, according to mortality or whatever protection we want to give, and just take for granted that the disease is going to spread and there's nothing to do about it?
Yeah, I think the evidence on whether it's possible to stop the spread of the disease, the question is like what end, right? Is it, are we aiming at zero COVID, or are we aiming at minimum mortality until the disease becomes endemic? I think that zero COVID is an impossibility. It's far too widespread in Europe and the Americas for that to be a reasonable strategy. So then the question is,
we're aiming to get any reproduction rate under 1.
Yes, but it's already under 1, right, in California, because the number of cases is declining. The issue,
keeping it there so we don't blow up again.
Well, the thing is like if you look at what if you compare states with very, very different policies with similar regional sort of where they are and geography wise, it doesn't look like there's a real viable strategy to stop this disease from spreading. It seems to spread. It has a season. It's COVID season, winter time, in Southern California. In the Midwest, it was winter season in the late fall. I think this idea that we can somehow, stage manage the disease, slow the spread, get it under 1 and keep it there, permanently. I think the real question to me isn't, sort of like, how can we slow the spread of the disease? I think that's effectively it's not possible. Like just places with very, very different policies regarding the lockdowns, Florida and California, for instance, have almost exactly the same number of cumulative cases to date and almost exactly the same age-adjusted mortality to date. The key question to me is, how do you protect the vulnerable? And we know that the disease mortality risk doubles with every 8 years of age. Every 8 years of age, so I think that's the right strategy, is to use the vaccine to protect the vulnerable. Just to give you some sense of this, if you look at the infection fatality rate that comes out of these seroprevalence studies, now 100 plus of them, it's the survival rate is 95% for people over 70 and 99.95% for people under 70. It's just a much, much more deadly disease. And if you do the math, like there's some folks who've done this at USC that I was just looking at their projections, you end up saving a lot more lives if you protect the vulnerable with the same number of vaccine doses. The key scarce resource now is the doses, right, of the vaccine. You just end up saving more lives. I think that's the long run thing. The question of like, what do you do with the under 70 and the economy? That's a really good question, but I think that there it's a question of trade-offs. You're basically saying, let's wait until everyone's vaccinated to open up. You're going to end up having, I think, more economic damage and more lives lost than if you protect the vulnerable with the vaccine. Now, Florida says they're going to vaccinate every person in nursing homes by the end of January. That's where 40% of the deaths have happened. That was definitely possible if we just chosen to do that in California. For people under 70 opening up, I think at that point, if you're comparing a 0.05% mortality risk, it's not giving up the way you characterize it, John. I guess I'd push back on that. I think the question is, it's not possible to think of a world where COVID doesn't exist anymore. right? That's just not, it's not possible, right? That's just,
no, but it's possible, which is the next question I want to get to is the long run on this, but it is very possible to think of a world in which the reproduction rate was more carefully managed, allowing us to have tests, allowing us to have vaccines. I'm still not convinced that, instead of lockdowns, for example, that getting the reproduction rate under one, the total, any of the models say the total cumulative number of people who get it or who die is very strongly affected by efforts to get it. And it doesn't have to be the government deciding. If you allow people to have or buy vaccines, then, Stanford could buy vaccines and open up again. A bar could buy vaccines and open up again. Airlines could buy vaccines and open up again. Just who needs to open up again is not something that the state of California is going to figure out. And again, old people can be protected by other means. Don't let them get the disease a little more carefully.
I mean, of course, I've been advocating for that from the beginning. I think that was the primary thing that we kind of needed to do was protect old people. And the pushback I got early was that it's impossible to do it. With the vaccine, we actually have a perfect technology to protect old people. I think the question of can we open? I guess the question is one of fear. Like, so what is your perception of a young person? Like, what's a young person's perception of their death risk should they get COVID? I mean, I saw a statistic that the young people think that their mortality risk is 17% from dying from COVID, when in fact it's under 0.05% should they get COVID. I think this fear of getting COVID is I think what drives that question. Like, why are the businesses not open? Because they're scared, right? They're scared to open it. In effect,
there's a large fraction of people with long run consequences of COVID.
So John, we don't know how large that fraction is, right?
I just think, though, it's really hard, except for those that are most vulnerable and who do not frequently interact with other generations or younger people. Certainly, that's the population to target. I think, and Jay, I don't know if you've seen any studies on this, but I think a lot of young people are really reticent about getting out, getting back to so-called normal life because of who else they're afraid of infecting, because these are younger people who interact with older people. These are younger people who interact with expectant mothers who are really don't really know what the effects could be if they were to contract the virus, or very young infants and so forth. So I think that there is an element of this in which it's very hard to put aside one particular population, except for, I would say, those that we already know are most vulnerable. And Jay, you're saying over 70, and especially those that are in these places where 40% of the deaths occurred. And so I guess the question is also one of logistics, though, too, right? We do want to get the most number of doses out as quickly as we can. I think there's a dynamic at work here, is that when you target a very discrete element of the population, it's harder logistically, right, to get the vaccines just to that discrete element of the population. If you do go to, hey, everybody over 70, let's go right now, come on, and you get it out more broadly, then I think that kind of that is an easier logistical problem to solve. And I just wondered, for Jay, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, in terms of the interaction across age groups, right, as well as what is the best policy that protects the most vulnerable, but also gets it done the fastest?
So this, I completely agree with the sentiment of this. The speed at which we vaccinate is incredibly important, and we failed at many, as California certainly failed at the worst. I think HR, I think the issue of this interactions between generations is really, really important. Like I've only seen my mom once. My 80-year-old mom lives in LA once in this whole epidemic, because I don't want to infect. She is actually at very high risk. Should she get this thing? And I cannot wait until she gets the vaccine. So then I don't care if I get the disease. I'm 52. My mortality risk is, 0.2. I'll take the risk to go visit my mom. Right. So I think that's really, really important. Protecting the vulnerable will free the less vulnerable and the people who care for them, because that really is the fear at the back of our heads. I don't want to kill my mom with this disease. And so I'm going to interact with her less. And we have multi-generational households all through California, identifying people who live in those households, older people, prioritizing them. And I completely agree with you also about the logistics. You send the vaccine to nursing homes. How hard is that? You get a list of vaccine. I mean, actually, you can tell me how hard that is, HR.
No, it's not that hard.
It's very hard. I heard a report. It took a 1 man-hour per shot to get a vaccine into nursing homes because you got to find the people and go over there and fill out the forms and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, we could reduce some of that kind of burden, right? I would imagine.
Well, once you go into now, you want a priority list about demonstrate you live in a multi-generational. I mean, you could.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think to start with the nursing homes. That's where 40% of the deaths are.
I'd like to ask a genuine question. So we got a snafu logistics to deliver it. We also have a supply problem. So why is supply still a problem? This is the greatest industrial economy of all time. We've known this thing since January 21st of 2020. Why are we not producing vaccine like crazy? Why is the AstraZeneca vaccine still not allowed in the US if we apparently have a pandemic going on? What stops someone? This was invented over a weekend. As an economist, I always look to competition. Why didn't someone invent a slightly different one over the next weekend and flood the market with this stuff?
I mean, I think so. There's lots that go into that, John. So first, this was a technology that was, I think, originally going to be used to like treat cancer, actually, and so it was sort of repurposed for this. That it would work in this setting was actually, in some ways, it was a gamble. Like if you'd asked me in April, in fact, I think someone did ask me in April, would we have a vaccine in a year? I would have said that's nuts. There's no chance. I mean, normally it takes 10 years to develop this. This new technology, this mRNA vaccine technology, is actually, the fact that it works is absolutely a game changer. In principle, we could use this as a tool to like develop, another vaccine over the weekend. In principle, the problem is testing it, right? So that you have to test it in populations, see if it works. That takes a long time. That technology still is a long, if you run a phase 3 randomized trial, it's going to be very, 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 very difficult. The manufacturing technology, it's an mRNA strand built inside this lipid thing in a sort of medical grade thing. It's actually kind of complicated. I mean, I don't know the full details of it, but to ramp that up does take some time. Operation Warp Speed, actually pushed that forward by essentially making the bet that the vaccine would work. And so we got started on that sometime in like July or August, I think.
Yeah. And hey, Jay, if I could just interject, I think this is something that was extremely positive because there were many people in the government, many people in the medical community who were saying, don't do it. It's too risky. Don't buy. Essentially, you're buying the doses up front. And the government said, we'll absorb the cost if it fails, right? So I think it's important to look at the scale of this. I mean, it's large scale, right, across our country relative to smaller countries like Israel, for example, who's going to be able to get, certainly more, more doses per capita out faster. And the second thing is, it is the complexity of the manufacturing. And I'll just, there's a big story behind this in terms of research and development over the years, mainly concerned with biological agents and the need for rapid prototyping against biological agents. And so, the military requirement for R&D for a long time for the applied research and the basic research was to develop the ability to prototype a vaccine in 24 hours and to be able to produce it at scale. And we had in mind, in part, a military unit or a city that was struck with a military grade biological agent. So this R&D is paying off. It's paying off. And this is, of course, not just government programs. There's government and private government funding for private research and so forth. But it's tough to do it at scale. And we would really be in a difficult position if the U.S. government had not made the risky decision up front to say, okay, we're just going to buy it now and start manufacturing.
Yeah, and I was on a radio show, actually, I think sometime in August or September, where they were asking me about this. Like, look, how come the government's paying Pfizer for manufacturing all these things, these doses? There's nothing vaccine. I said, and that's exactly right. It was a big gamble, but it's a gamble that paid off. And we should be really happy it paid off.
I wonder if I could break my silence, if it's possible, to get John to stop firing his carefully prepped questions at Jay.
I'm making it up as I go along.
I hate to butt in, but there's something we should quickly address, and that is that this is a moving target. That the virus has been mutating since the get-go, but the big news that certainly affected my outlook of the last few weeks has been the new variant discovered in the UK that is, it turns out, more infectious, and it seems also somewhat more lethal than earlier variants. And even more alarming, new variants in South Africa and Brazil look like they might have ways around vaccination, or might somewhat impair the effectiveness of antibodies in people who've been infected with previous strains. Now, I wanted to ask you a question, Jay, which I kind of asked myself. Going back to your Great Barrington Declaration in October and how the world looked back then, I think I was pretty much with you in your argument that lockdowns were an unnecessarily blunt instrument to cope with this peculiar ageist disease. But it seems like events since then have in some ways legitimized lockdowns. If you think about the UK case, it was with a lockdown that case numbers went absolutely soaring upwards. And that was the new variant, largely, though not entirely. So I want to ask you the kind of the hard question. Do you think you were on the wrong side of that whole debate back in October and underestimated what the virus could do to surprise us? And would you write it differently today?
Neil, that's a fantastic question. Thank you for the opportunity to address it. So the Great Barrington Declaration was something that I wrote with Sunetra Gupta at Oxford and Martin Kulldorff at Harvard in October. The argument was that the lockdown harms are absolutely enormous for people under 70. Whereas the disease is quite deadly for people over 70. And so for people over 70, we should do a policy of focused protection, sort of do everything we possibly can to reduce the probability that they get the disease. Whereas for people under 70, the lockdowns are so deadly and terrible that we basically should do as much as we can to carefully open up, right? So open schools in the United States, for instance, let businesses run, obviously with no one's going to come in without any protections, but don't have closure orders, things like that. So that was the Great Barrington Declaration proposal. To address your question, Neil, so the pushback we got was twofold. One was that focus protection is impossible. That there's no possible way we could have actually protected. And actually, I was kind of shocked by that. I've been in public health for a very long time, and I have always thought that public health people, if there's one thing that they're really good at, is thinking of imaginative ways to try to protect vulnerable people, and just sort of throw their hands up and give up absolutely shocked me. I still think I was on the right side of that. I think that the public health authorities should have been much more imaginative at the time in trying to think of ways to protect the vulnerable. There's some. So just I'll give you one example. A thing that occurred to me as an obvious policy we could have used in the U.S. We have these essential workers. Say you're older and you're essential. Well, we have workplace disability laws that give you accommodation if you have a disability. Treat vulnerability to COVID as a disability. And so you have to have some workplace accommodation that, if you're a teacher, for instance, you teach, but you can have a Zoom class if you're over 64 or something, at 63 or something, or you're 60 or something, and you have some chronic conditions. In person if you're 25 or something, right? So I think those kinds of ideas, I don't understand to this day why people thought it was impossible to completely protect. I mean, of course, complete protection would have been impossible. Better protection of nursing homes, I think, is possible. You can see this in age gradients of who actually got the disease in places that did better. Places that did better, the age gradient is more young people got the disease than old people. On places that did worse, like California, old and young people get the disease at roughly the same rate. So I think in that sense, I think we got it right. In the sense of like, are lockdowns deadly? I still also think we got it right. They are deadly. We have basically robbed a generation of children in the United States from a full year of schooling, with consequences that will last us, like how do you teach a 6-year-old to read over Zoom? The answer is you don't. So you get illiteracy that will last for, we just have, and the inequality of it is absolutely enormous. Like it's unimaginable. Like probably the worst policy as far as promoting inequality that I've ever seen. So I think in that sense, we still got it right. The question of, was the vaccine going to come as a way to get us out of this? That's, I think, is the heart of your question, Neil, right? And of course, as I've confessed, I didn't think that the vaccine was going to come in April. I was somewhat more hopeful in October, but of course, we couldn't know if it was going to work in the randomized trials. Neither could the people who signed the John Snow memorandum opposing us. So I think there's an uncertainty there. And the question then is, again, what do you do with the vaccine once you have it, right? So for the lockdowners, what they're arguing for is use the vaccine to vaccinate everybody, right? Before you open up, before you have any semblance of return to normal. I think the vaccine essentially is it doesn't get you out of it. It essentially, like, it doesn't actually help the lockdown strategy a ton. Whereas for the strategy we advocated, the Great Barrington strategy, the vaccine is a game changer. Now the argument that you can't protect the vulnerable is gone. So I don't know. I'm not sure I would change a lot other than to increase now. In retrospect, now that I know the vaccine worked, just to like push a little bit more about what would have happened if the vaccine were to work.
But there's also a counterfactual question, if I may. What if back in October, everyone had agreed with you? If they had, that was just at the moment that there were big increases in case numbers in Europe and in the Northeast, particularly of the United States. In the counterfactual, where the Great Barrington Declaration is universally adopted by governments, then I think today we would be looking at a much higher death toll.
So I don't agree with that, Neil. I think the question is the possibility of focused protection. Because the premise under your thought is that the lockdowns actually protected the vulnerable. I don't think that's true. Like, if you look at the actual practice of the lockdowns, California is a fantastic example. Okay. So in California, who have the lockdowns actually protected? Well, they protected they protected the rich, right? They protected, whereas Hispanics, people living in poor neighborhoods have all essentially been exposed despite the lockdown. I think the death rate would have been very, very similar if we had not done focused protection. So let me just address your counterfactual, because I think that's really the right one. If we had adopted the Great Barrington Declaration, that's a call for focused protection, and we had launched this like Manhattan Project of how to protect the vulnerable, we would have actually had much lower death rates, I think.
I want to jump in and try to get you guys to clarify what you mean by lockdown, because my impression of this is there's a lot of perfection getting in the way of the good. We know this spreads in isolated sort of super spreader fashion. So lockdown tends to mean economic lockdown, businesses must shut down. But we also know this doesn't spread in an auto body paint shop. Closing down outdoor dining that isn't behind that's really outdoor, not behind a plastic wrap, is completely pointless. Closing down parks is completely pointless. So at least I think the fact we need to face is economic lockdown is this doesn't spread in business, this spreads in parties. And what happened in the fall had a lot to do with Thanksgiving and people hanging around in each other's houses. Economic lockdown isn't really, it doesn't have to do with the way this spreads. And we have a lot of technologies we're not using. Testing. The CDC stopped testing for two months. Then it forbade Stanford for doing its own testing. The FDA still doesn't allow us to use tests at home without a doctor's prescription. There's a lot of technology we can use to stop the actual spread that's in parties. Thanksgiving. Suppose we had been allowed $2 home paper strip tests. Not perfect, but $2 home paper strip tests. That would have done it. we would not have had the big social spread at Thanksgiving. So focusing on economic lockdowns where you force businesses to shut down willy-nilly seems to me like an artificial distinction. We need to be more clear about what you mean by lockdown here.
So, John, I completely agree with that. I mean, 100% agree with that. So I think that
Neil doesn't yet.
What? Just well,
I mean, just to be clear, my position is that of devil's advocate. Just to refresh.
I don't think, but none of this is personal. I mean, you guys, we're trying to.
Regular listeners will know that we were very close to your position last year, and often discussed the unwisdom of lockdowns and the unintended costs that they were imposing socially. So my position is more that I look back on that time and wonder if I was a little optimistic about how well it would have worked. And particularly given not just the new strains, but that big liftoff in case numbers that not many people expected to happen in Europe, which was driven actually by colleges going back as much, if not more than by Thanksgiving. John, by Thanksgiving, it had already happened, and that just made it a bit worse. But actually,
Jay, what happened in the fall
outbreak? So you guys, let me. So there's like, I've been writing down. You guys have like been firing these things at me, and actually, this is really fun. I have to say, because I've been wanting this kind of debate, and I've been shocked at how difficult it's been to get the other side to debate. And so devil's advocate is great, actually.
Yeah, we basically agreed with the Great Barrington Declaration, but I'm kind of asking myself,
no, I think these are the right questions.
Was I too sanguine about it? And can I add one last data point? When we talk about California, we're basically talking about Los Angeles because 41% of deaths were in LA County, 55% of cases and 48% of deaths were Latino. And I think one of the things that I completely agree with you about is that we've come up with solutions to the problem of the pandemic that have worked very well for the rich. We did not have a credible solution for Los Angeles Latinos. And I'd love to know how you would have actually protected the elderly people in that community from the younger generations of their families. Because I actually, when I look back on Great Barrington, the thing I missed was that was the social group it was really hard to protect, given the ways in which they live, cheek by jowl in multi-generational family homes.
I've been calling this trickle-down epidemiology. That's what the lockdowns are. I think. So let me. So I have a list of you guys have been firing at me. So let me just start with the variants. So first, I think the variant you should expect when you're reaching closer to herd immunity that variants will compete with each other that are marginally more fit and will take over. Right. So a lot of the modeling around this, I think, especially like this, the disease spread, I think it's exactly what you'd expect as you get closer and closer to larger and larger fractions of the population already been infected. Right? There's the few variants competing for the relatively few people still left, to infect, and so you will see some variant take over. That's just like the B117 in the UK. I think there's some aspect of that. I think the evidence on whether it's more deadly is terrible. I don't think it's more deadly. At least I haven't seen any evidence that convinces me that it's more deadly. And the evidence about the vaccine protecting, I think the evidence is that if it doesn't completely protect, it seems like it's still neutralizing. But even if it's not entirely neutralizing, it's at least partially neutralizing. You have at least partial protection. That's pretty good. Right? And, I think over time we'll learn more. Obviously this is still early days, and that's in the sense of like, what variants what the properties of the variants are. But
can you make projections at this point, Jay, when you think based on supply and our ability to administer, across these, the different priority groups, when do you think we're going to see a change, in our ability to go back to something closer to normal? I just want to point out, I think we're vaccinated about 24 million people in the United States now, which is by far the largest number in the world. I think China's like 15 million. Israel, which is the best at getting at this problem from a per capita perspective, I think is about I think they're almost close to 50% vaccinated, but that's 4.1 million. So just to give you an idea, right? They're 49%, 4.1 million. We've done, almost 24 million, I think now, and we're about a little bit over 7% of our population. So we have to consider the scale, right? It's like when Nazi Germany decided to invade, the Soviet Union. They looked at the map but forgot to look at the scale, right? You have to understand, I think, this is a large endeavor for a large country like ours.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think okay, this is like soothsaying, so I'm gonna get in trouble for this. But I think it depends on the strategy we take. Like, if you are asking how long it would take to vaccinate the elderly population, I think by April is feasible. I mean, it's like, because and frankly, you know better than me, HR, about this. But like, I think that identifying the elderly people who live in nursing homes, that's relatively easy. Identifying people who live in multi-generational homes, that's a little harder. But actually, there are federal programs that can do this. There's a federal agency called ASPR that every time there's a natural disaster, it like gets a list. I know because I've worked on this, a list of like every elderly person living within the area that has oxygen tank needs or whatever. And so the public health officials know who to go help in those. I mean, we could use those kinds of federal programs to try to identify older people all throughout the U.S. I think by April. And then the question is, do we wait until everyone's vaccinated? I don't think there's a reason to do that at that point. And John, we could use your idea about the testing. Get the cheap tests available so that businesses just have them. Like $2. I mean, that is those tests, those antigen tests are really, really inexpensive. The only reason we don't have them everywhere is the FDA hasn't let us have them everywhere.
That's right. Get out of the way is always the first answer.
Yeah. Hey, could I ask you a question? It seems to me that the goal here is to reach herd immunity. And I saw you quoted in the Washington Post the other day suggesting that there maybe is not a definition for herd immunity. So if the end is to reach this magical number, what is the magical number? Is it X number of Americans? Can the scientific community agree on what the goal is here?
No, nobody knows that number. And it's different in different places. I'll tell you what it is technically. Technically is it's a situation where every additional person, it's an equilibrium situation where one additional person getting infected infects one or fewer other additional people. Mm-hmm. That's it. That's what herd immunity means. And nobody knows what that number is.
Well, because it depends on behavior as much as biology. If people are more careful, the herd immunity is lower.
And it depends not only on the vaccine, I think, right? But it depends on who's already had it. And
yeah, I mean, I'll tell you,
because they already had it.
I think about 140 million people have had infections in the U.S. to date. 140 million. And the way I get to that is, if you look at the number of people who've died to date, and divide by the infection, whatever your guess for the infection fatality rate is, let's say my best guess for the U.S. is like 0.35. You get to about 140 million people infected to date.
What do we know about how long that confers immunity and how long the vaccine confers immunity?
So the natural immunity is pretty well established now. So there's papers in Nature, Cell, a whole bunch of other places that it's not just antibody mediated immunity, but also T cells and B cell, memory B cells, a whole panoply of immune mechanisms that confer very long lasting immunity in other diseases. For instance, for other coronaviruses could last years. And when you're reinfected, even if after a long time, your body still remembers to some extent that the reinfection tends to be much less severe than the original infection. The long run of this disease is an endemic coronavirus in the population, right? Where you'll get it as a kid, it'll be mild, and you'll keep getting it, every few years, and you'll just be a cold.
Jay, can I ask a slightly different question? Because we're enjoying this masterclass in epidemiology, but I want to ask a question really about the sociology of your field. One of the puzzling things about 2020 was how quickly, around about March, a consensus formed that we had to do drastic lockdowns, including things like closing parks that even at the time seemed slightly mad. And you were one of a relative minority of experts who were arguing against that and often being publicly attacked for doing so. I wonder, looking back on it, why that was. My impression was that, particularly in the Western democracies, there was a kind of disastrous failure in January and February and into March to learn from what was happening in Taiwan and South Korea, followed by panic when it became clear that the virus was very widely seeded in the Western world. And then a relatively small amount of research, e.g. by Imperial College London, where there's a man named Niall Ferguson who isn't me, caused a huge policy shift, 180-degree turn. And I just wonder why that happened. And why were you so I guess, outmaneuvered by proponents of very drastic non-pharmaceutical measures that cratered our economy in ways that John's profession is still trying to get their heads around. Why did that happen?
Why did they get to proclaim themselves economic experts?
I mean, John, if
leave behavior out of their models.
I think that's just it. Like we economists fell down on the job, John. I think. Like
we were screaming loudly the whole time.
Maybe you, John, but there were just as a general rule, we were cowed, right? We basically we said there was this moral challenge to us that you're favoring money over lives, and that ended it for economists. For the most part, economists, I think it played a very poor role. You accepted, John, of course. But I think it played a very poor role in this, because we actually should have been screaming loudly about the cost of the lockdowns, the harms, all those things that have not actually helped slow disease spread. We knew in March that we shouldn't have closed the schools, actually. I mean, even, we knew because the children weren't really affected. The study that came out of Iceland about the reduced probability of disease spread from child to adult, that came out in early April. If I remember right, at least sort of early versions of it. I mean, we should have been screaming loudly about the harms of the lockdown. That should have been in our. So we had this panic where people focused on the purported benefits of the lockdown. And you weren't allowed to say anything about the cost. So we adopted a policy thinking that we were only benefits. And this like thinking this, there was also this sort of like, emphasis on the uncertainty, right? So this precautionary principle idea that, there's this huge tail risk of what this disease could be like. In fact, John Ioannidis wrote a sort of very famous Stat News piece where he said it could be somewhere between 40 million deaths in the U.S. or 10,000 deaths in the U.S. We don't have any idea, and people in the panic focused on, oh my God, it could be a very large number of deaths, and the Imperial College model sort of solidified that. I think you go back and write the history of this, that will play an enormous role in people's thinking in those days. They just sort of, and if you look back on the actual model itself, it was terrible. Like it was based on guesses about the infection fatality rate, the R number, a whole bunch of things that they had absolutely no business making guesses over, or at least providing us with enormous range of uncertainty around it.
Well, the R number did not include people's behavior. It didn't include people who say, oh, shit, right. I might get sick and then do something about it. I got to defend us economists. The economists were loudly screaming about it. Even within the administration, the economists were loudly screaming about it, which is why, I mean, the current thing is, oh, Trump didn't do enough. But in fact, it's because he was listening to his economists who said this stuff was not a good idea. The lockdowns came from a governor level. And perhaps from a populace who
I think that we needed to have a seat at the table that was more effective, right?
Can I just point out the irony or the paradox that economists are complaining about other people getting in their business instead of the other way around for a change, and then also to say that it's unfortunate this interaction that we saw, right? I mean, we saw this interaction where people they immediately went like ad hominem, and how can you not be for a complete shutdown? You must not care about humanity, and of course these are the people who are unaffected. By the shutdowns because their jobs didn't depend on interacting with other people. There was this big disparity. I think if there's a disparity in class, it was those who were the loudest in condemnation, but who actually didn't take a big hit in their paychecks. And if they were in New York, they moved out to the Hamptons. And to loudly decry the fact that the New York City wasn't completely shut down. So I think there's an element of this that then generated an interaction. On the other side, people said, well, I'm not going to wear a mask because, that's infringing on my civil liberties. I mean, it was like two equally irrational positions that seemed to push everybody toward those extremes instead of course, doing what might be sensible to do.
But leaving aside the politics of it, and the intellectual side, the academic side, I'm actually heartened by how much economists and epidemiologists started talking to each other, created a round of behavioral SIR models that include both that I think are a great product of this, and who can give us better scientific advice if anyone wants to listen to scientific advice next time around.
I mean, I've been following Tom Phillipson's work for 2 decades, and he's been arguing for those for a long time. Actually, I wrote one myself for the H1N1 12 years ago. But I mean, I don't know. I think we were very ineffective, John. I guess I can't excuse us. I guess there's also some element of like personal, my personal experience was arguing with econometricians about standard errors instead of talking about how lockdown harms. I think there's this like nerdiness in us that sort of got in our way of being effective. I don't know. I mean, there's some element of that too.
Can I move us on to, I want to talk about the long run, where your medical knowledge will help a lot, or at least there's things I know I don't know. You mentioned that this will become chronic. Now, one question is whether it becomes chronic in the way that we all get it when we're young and repeatedly, like the common cold, or does it become chronic, but we get vaccines? Perhaps is the miracle of mRNA vaccines, will they become like flu vaccines where they can adjust them, target them, and we trust mRNA so much we don't have to go through 3 phases of clinical trials and the usual 10 years before we can do it. On the other hand, this is a disease that mutates. It's a disease that has human hosts and natural hosts. That's usually a sign of something that will have waves, and then it'll go back to its hosts, and then it'll get reseeded when people's immunity is gone. But what's your opinion on the long run of this?
I mean, I don't know the answer to the vaccine yet, because the issue is it's not like the flu in that sense. Like the flu mutates in ways where the previous vaccine really doesn't protect you very much. There's not much cross protection. I think if I had to hazard a guess about that, John, is that the vaccine we currently have will provide substantial protection, even against mutated forms of this. It's again, because it's not like the flu.
The technology sounds like it allows you every January 21st, take a weekend off, sequence what's out there, and you got a new vaccine the next Monday.
I mean, in principle, yeah, you could do that. I mean, I don't think people will be comfortable with that. Just like lickety split. It'll take some doing to
get. I think in the long run future.
Yeah, I mean, I think like with the flu, it took a while to get to the point where we didn't need to run a randomized trial every season. So I think there's some element of getting comfortable with this technology. I do think this mRNA technology is absolutely transformative, because it's not now. I mean, like people are talking about using it for almost every infectious disease in principle. Maybe it's the end of infectious disease. Who knows? I mean, if we're going to dream.
Well, that's the dream I was asking you to speculate about.
Yeah. So I think that's it's going to be a little while before people are comfortable with that, is my guess. But as far as like this disease, this particular COVID disease, I think that the vaccine, there's this particular target, this spike protein that's specific to this, where the antibodies producing very, very effective, even against most of the variants. In fact, every variant, I think, that I've seen. If I don't know exactly the number, the percent effective, I think that unlike the flu, we won't have to reformulate it every year. I think we'll just basically have, if anything, minor tweaks. And do we need to have it every year? I don't even know the answer to that, because the vaccine seems to induce some sort of T cell response, some sort of like widespread immune response that has the hallmarks of being somewhat long lasting. So we'll see, I guess, is the answer to that. The vaccine's been around for 2 months, so it's hard to answer definitively, but I'm very hopeful at this point.
Neil, you look very contemplative.
I'm contemplating the future and trying to imagine a bunch of different futures. I'm sure everybody listening has asked at least once in the last 24 hours, when can we get back to normal? And I suppose the answer to that is, well, it may not be quite that normal, the normal that you remember from 2019. Because we may approach each flu season with greater trepidation in future. A lot depends, I think, on what happens in the less developed world. If we get vaccination right in the northern hemisphere, but not in the southern hemisphere, does that become a place where the mutation game just keeps on producing more challenging variants? Is excess mortality going to be higher each winter, at least for the next few years? Will masks be in our pockets when this time next year? That's I guess my question for you, Jay. Do you see a way back to full normal, or are we going to find ourselves maybe living a bit more like East Asians with masks at the ready each winter and no more hugging and handshaking and all that kissing stuff, which I rather object to, bowing or at least confining ourselves to elbow bumps. How big a change do you think this is going to be, and for how long?
I mean, I think you're broadening it out to a world's perspective is a very, very good thought, right? Because I think so. For instance, I just saw in New Zealand they're not planning to open borders for 2 years, right? And it's going to take some time to get them vaccinated because they're not really. I mean, it just will. I think and actually, as far as the question of like what will happen regarding other infectious diseases, the flu is a good example of this. There's no flu or very, very little flu in the Northern Hemisphere this year, and there was none in the Southern Hemisphere this year. It seems like probably the most parsimonious explanation is shutting down international travel, stop the spread of the flu from the north to the south and south to the north. At least that's the one I'm currently in favor of right now.
Not the masks and distancing.
There's now 14 randomized trials on masks and the spread of the flu, and they all find zero. It's really unlikely that it would stop the flu, but not COVID. I mean, it seems like that's not the most parsimonious explanation. I mean, I could be wrong, but because I think this is one of these things where it's a genuine medical mystery. Why did the flu disappear? I think the shifts in the restrictions in interactions of populations will have a big role in the future you're talking about, Neil. So if it's the case that these restrictions continue, we probably will see lower infectious disease. We won't really. People will still be scared of them and won't go back to normal. That's one possible future. I mean, actually, I look at Florida. Florida's a good example of a place where I think they are actually have opened up. Disney World is open. I think people shake hands in Florida, which is hard to believe, I think. It's almost like a foreign country we're talking about here, right? In Sweden, there are these like, my friends send me these like videos of people shopping in Sweden, and they're like, they went into the shop and they're not wearing a mask in the shop. I mean, it's one of these things where like it really does feel like a foreign land.
Jay, remind me to send you some Carl Hyacin books if you want to read about Florida. But we're getting short on time here, so why don't we go around the horn? Let's ask each of the GoodFellows for some closing thoughts, just on maybe what you've learned today, but also if we're going to accept that future strains, future pandemics are way of the future, just what we do differently. HR, why don't you start?
Well, I'll just say I had the great fortune of getting to know Jay during the pandemic. And I think that what our viewers got today is an example that we can apply across all professions, even when debating or discussing, the most, emotion evoking issues, like this pandemic. Jay has been sort of an example of professionalism and respect. And Jay, I just want to say I really appreciate your commitment to having respectful, meaningful discussions about the challenges we're facing. And maybe even our politicians could follow your example at some point.
Okay. John, you've been very shy and retiring on this broadcast. What are your final thoughts?
Mr. Kumbaya. He's always trying to get people to get along better.
It's true. How can you not love Jay? I mean, really?
No, you.
Even you, John. Even your heart should be warmed by a conversation with Jay.
I'm sure you're from Philadelphia, by the way.
So I'm always worried. I mean, my view is that this one was the fire drill. Most pandemics killed way more people than this one did. And our society needed a fire drill. Will we pay attention, or will, like all those stocks of masks and stuff that we forgot to maintain, and all those great pandemic plans that nobody knew where they were when the time comes? Maybe there's something hopeful in this vision that it becomes somewhat endemic, that people keep paying attention to it. And then there's a future where, masks are still in our pockets. We pay attention to indoor ventilation so that the indoor can be as safe as the outdoor. We pay attention to general communicable respiratory disease spread and bring that down, where mRNA is accepted as the thing. It can be developed much more quickly. Where we have tests, where I hope we learn the importance of letting people know what's inside their bodies. That I think the idea of tests as being a way of stopping a disease spread, not just diagnosing an individual patient, needs to get through the thick head of the FDA. But can we look forward to a world where we need bureaucratic competence? Can our leaders say the lesson of this is we need a much more effective public bureaucracy and keep the preparations in place so that when The next one comes out of the next lab in China, or we also need a better international surveillance system, but so that the world is perpetually ready and also perpetually much more flexible. That's my hopeful one, and I hope for it.
Niall.
I think we should take away from this discussion the importance of acknowledging what we don't know. And what is great about Jay is that at each stage of our conversation, he's acknowledged that there is a lot that we don't know. And decision-making under uncertainty isn't something that's confined to pandemics. Yet in my new book that comes out in May, I predict that the next disaster will not be a pandemic. It will be something else that we've completely forgotten about, or at least stopped thinking about. So yeah, let's try to draw a broader conclusion from this harrowing experience. And that should be that we need to think better about how to take decisions under uncertainty when there actually aren't sufficient data to have very high confidence. So yeah, that's why I think if we make decisions that way, we'll cope better with the next disaster than we coped with this one. I still have a sense that this is the sort of darkness before the dawn, and that things are going to improve much more rapidly in the US than most people currently expect. And one can already see that even in the Californian data that we began by talking about. So I think we go from a very gloomy winter to a rather buoyant spring and summer. And that actually, if Chinese behavior in Wuhan is anything to go by, and it's a year since Wuhan was under complete lockdown, and Wuhan today is just as Jay was describing Sweden, a place that's largely back to normal. I think we're going to get there, and we'll look back and say, was it all a dream? Was it all a nightmare? Well, it was a nightmare, and the nightmare was made much worse by bad decision-making under uncertainty.
Right, but Niall,
too complicated plans.
But Niall, as you like to remind us, stuff happens.
Stuff happens. Events, dear boy, events. And I'm sure we'll be blindsided by something later in 2021 that nobody put in their predictions.
Well, Dr. Bhattacharya, since you were kind enough to share an hour with us and engage in the intellectual joust, I hope you enjoyed this today. We're going to give you the courtesy of having the last word.
I just want to thank the three of you. I've just had just a delightful time. I wish this had been the norm all through the whole epidemic. This kind of open exchange. I think while science has done very well in many ways with the vaccine, the harm to open scientific discourse, censorship in science, all these kind of things that have happened, I think, are things that we're going to need to work to repair. And this is exactly the way to repair it, to have these kinds of conversations between people who we're trying to learn from one another.
Okay, and that is a wrap. That's it for this episode of GoodFellows. We'll be back soon with a new episode, a new conversation. On behalf of Hoover's GoodFellows, Niall Ferguson, H.R. McMaster, John Cochrane, and our special guest today, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, we wish you and yours the very best. Stay safe, stay healthy. We'll do our best here at the Hoover Institution to help you stay informed. We'll see you next week.